Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. I'm your host, Jack Segal. Our special guest today is Brian McCall. Brian is a liberal arts instructor at Interlochen Arts Academy. He teaches history at Northwestern Michigan College, and part-time he teaches history at Ferris State University. We know him well as an expert on World War I, and that's our topic today. Welcome back, Brian McCall.
Jack, glad to be back.
Great to see you again.
And we'll end the war today.
We will end the war today. Well, I'm sure people went to the war thinking, I wish it would end today too.
They're always supposed to be over by Christmas, and this time it'll actually be the case.
Okay.
So, and with the 100th anniversary coming up next year, I really appreciate the chance to come on your program to talk about this. And I'm really interested to see what will happen in the calendar year 2014 with the run-up to the August that ended the old world, as all of us that have lived in the 20th century and beyond now. That world that existed before 1914 died in these 4 years that happened beginning 100 years ago. And I think this will be a really interesting time to see how media and other people in government and education and all kinds of other fields look at this 100-year anniversary and deal with it in the way that it really needs to be, as something really serious and monumental and consequential. So I'm excited about next year.
Well, it's a good thing to be excited about because it was certainly a world-changing series of events, and the carnage, the costs to humankind are almost incalculable.
Right.
So if we can learn any lessons from that experience, we'll be perhaps a little better off. Now, where we left the discussion last time, we were somewhere around the end of 1916.
1916, yep.
And there were, I think, at that point, the beginnings of what looked like a stalemate on the Western Front.
Well, what had happened by the end of 16 was a clear understanding of anyone who had been there, especially the survivors of the front lines, that the tactics and strategies of the Western Front were doomed to fail. There was no connection between the capabilities of the weapons that the men had, the firepower of modern artillery in particular, which killed more people than anything else, and the tactics that these men were being ordered to their deaths, or in some cases, if you can call it even worse, their complete disappearance, because the power of the shells that were being used on these front lines was so tremendous that men by the dozens would just disappear. One of the more striking things about World War I is how many bodies were never recovered. And you can't take any of what happened, and there was no way to romanticize or sanitize or put anything on what was going on in those trenches with anything other than it was just absolutely unbelievable carnage. And those that survived knew that this was whatever hope they had in humanity was dying along with all of their friends. So those survivors of this were, there was a reason why F. Scott Fitzgerald called them the lost generation, and the Americans who were going to be involved in this later were only there for about 18 months. So for the French, the Germans, the British, and everybody else, it was hell on earth, especially in 1916, and especially on the Somme and in Verdun, France. Verdun, of the two battlefields, Somme is a little bit larger, it's about 25-mile front, whereas the Somme is a smaller, more compact place of just unimaginable suffering, unimaginable.
Give us a sense of how many people were killed in the battle.
At Verdun, the best numbers is probably 850,000 people over the course of 6 months, and it is almost all of them are soldiers. That's another interesting thing about World War I. It's the first battle, or the first war, where the primary victims are soldiers, which sounds odd when you think about war, especially with people's modern conceptions of what war looks like. The 20th century changes that, but earlier wars also, disease, famine, crop failure, looting, pillaging. Civilians always paid far more of a cost in almost every war up to this one. But because of the way that the battles were fought so close to each other on these very tight fronts of that 500-mile long front, the actual number of people who are killed tend to be soldiers. Some civilians were killed, but not anything like the numbers we'll see in World War II, or certainly not what happened in Germany in the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. So that is something that is quite unique about World War I. So the death tolls, the concentration of firepower, the amount of just incredible body counts of, well, the French, for example, for the casualty figures for 1914, they just refused to release them. They wouldn't let anybody know. 1914 was so bad for France that 1 million of their men were killed or wounded in the period between August and December. The families of those men and women, mostly men, were never told what happened to their sons. They were lost to France.
So by the end of 1916, villages in France and Germany, for that matter, were experiencing an entire generation of young men being wiped out.
That is one of the more interesting events that happened in all over Europe that is really unique, again, to World War I. Some Americans who are watching your show know of a town in Virginia called Bedford, and there's a collection of, there's a World War II memorial there dedicated to the D-Day landings. I remember that the dedication for that happened very close to September 11th, pretty close to that in 2001. Bedford lost, I believe, 29 or 30, I'm not sure the right number, of their young men who were killed on D-Day. Take that example, take Traverse City, for example, a town of roughly 15,000 in the city proper. Take the graduating classes of Central West and Central High, add in Grand Traverse Academy, basically all the high schools, all the seniors and juniors, freshmen at Northwestern Community College, and kill them all off in about the course of a morning. And that's what you would have happen continually on the Somme and at Verdun. Verdun, it would have been a little bit more rare for a whole village to be decimated in terms of all their young men being killed on the same day, because the French tended to spread their soldiers around a little bit more, and they didn't concentrate them based on villages and units. But the British had recruited specifically. They'd gone to factories, they'd gone to towns, they'd gone to villages, and they would place all these men in one battalion. They'd all get up out of the trench in the morning and they'd be dead in the afternoon. And the whole town would find out, you know, sometimes legitimate through official means, but more often than not, they would find out unofficially, as word would gotten back that they all went over the top, and or the Australians say they went over the hill, and they never came back. So this was just the tragedy of all of this is just hard for anyone in the 21st century to really get a firm grip on.
So what was the reaction back home? Did were there weakening feelings that people wanted to get out of the war somehow?
I think at that point, by the end of 16, you're going to see more people coming back out of the trenches with self-inflicted gunshot wounds, of people who had clear signs of PTSD today, what we would call that. Then obviously it's shell shock. They can't feed themselves any longer. They have tremors that don't stop. They don't turn it on and off like a faucet either. It's just permanent now. The mental hospitals were filling up as much as they could take some of these people. Of course, the authorities who are recruiting and building these armies back home view all of this as shirking, as cowardice, as treason.
And some people were executed for running away. Yeah.
One of my absolute favorite films from this period, not made in the war, but about the war, is Paths of Glory with Kirk Douglas. It's a short film. The kicker is, if your viewers know him, it's Stanley Kubrick's first big feature film. Black and white, 90 minutes, and it's about this exact scenario of men who won't get out of a trench because they know it means certain death. How do French official, it's set during basically the Verdun battle, how does the French high command deal with men who won't fight. And that was happening more.
And so the French tended to change their tactics, didn't they, in reaction to this? They kind of stopped their offensive.
They had to. In the end, but that will happen later in 17. But the Verdun was put in a way that if they lost that city, that was the beginning of the end of France. And so the commander, Pétain, and some of the other people, his subordinates underneath him, it became this very strange, schizophrenic place in that French people back in Paris knew of it and had a feeling that the war hinged on it, but they would never go to it, and they didn't really know what it meant. But they knew that a lot of Frenchmen were headed to die for France. And how did French people envision French soldiers died? Well, an angel came down and brought them up to heaven, where they joined all the other French soldiers who have died for France. I've seen some of these really unbelievable allegorical paintings of, what it meant for civilians as opposed to what soldiers really knew what it meant, which was it was dirty and was horrible and it was unbelievable.
Were the Germans, the German population, were they weakening, or did they see one last chance to win this war?
Information about what was happening on the Western Front was obviously on both sides enormous censorship. And there was a real attempt they didn't have WikiLeaks back then. So there was an enormous attempt to keep a clamp on what actually it looked like. So all the people who came through it and survived were heroes. Those who died for the fatherland died, bravely. But there wasn't a real sense of what real futility this was. That said, people back home in Germany could read maps, and they would print them. And you can only put your army in front of one place before it's taken it for weeks on end and say everything's going great, and people start to question what that actually means. And that was happening at Verdun. So probably more than any other place, the other parts of the map for the Germans were really clear. It was about holding the line. But the Verdun battle was about taking that place. It's the only real offensive that the Germans will launch outside of the one that they started the war with in 1914, and the one that they'll try to end the war with in 1918 is this one on Verdun. And it fails. They never get it. They never get the city.
So the entire year of 1918, they're slugging it out, trench to trench, and they're not really moving.
Let's go to 17 first.
Okay.
So we'll finish, at the end of 16, there's a sense of futility, mainly on the front lines. But it hasn't really filtered back to home. 17 is where the beginning of the end happens at home. This is the point where there are no young men, really, left in a lot of these places that can fill and step up and take the place of the enormous losses. The daycare becomes absolutely critical for big factories and towns where munitions are being made, because so many women have now been drafted into the factories to work at war production. There's a real sense of the cost of living is beginning to crack, and food prices are going up and food supplies, more critically, are going down. How many children died of malnutrition in Germany because of the blockade of the British is anyone's guess, but it may be in the hundreds of thousands. We don't know. Those are figures that are tough to get a handle on, what caused a child's death as opposed to a battlefield death.
But this is full
But this
mobilization.
is starting to
for the first
really begin to bite. And if you had gone through a German city or a German village in 1917, you would have noticed the complete absence of young men, a lot of invalids returning without arms and legs, and a lot of widows and a lot of old women and children. It would have been a very strange place. And that, of course, in France would have been replicated in England. These three protagonists, and we haven't got to the big one yet, Russia, are all starting to show real big signs of strain in 1917. The blockades on each of them are starting to really take hold. The Germans begin to sink every ship on the high seas with their submarines.
Using their submarines,
They had held them back for about a year and a half after the Lusitania and the fear that the Americans would get involved. That now is off the table. It's now or never. They began to sink every ship that they can see. And they don't have any out there to lose, so and the British...
They sank thousands of ships, is that right?
Hundreds for sure, hundreds of thousands of tons. And for every ship that sank, there goes food from Canada, fuel from the Middle East. One of the accounts I never forgot was an account of a U-boat captain who torpedoed a ship, who saw they were very excited on their U-boat, and they saw the ship coming up. He could actually see the face of the captain through his periscope. He got that close. The torpedoes hit home, and then he sees what's on the ship. It's filled with horses. Exactly. And he looked through that, and a couple of his crewmen, the command structure in a submarine is more like a family than a royal hierarchy, but a few crewmen also looked through the periscope and see what was happening. And the men were jumping off the ship, but the horses obviously couldn't. And he said that was the most searing thing that he'll remember from the war, was the fact that he had killed all these horses. But it was legitimate. It was that was war material. It had to be done. Hospital ships. You could justify sometimes doing that. Whatever rules of engagement, by this point, poison gas had been used pretty substantially, which is the most devastating of weapons in terms of psychological effect. It's also one of the most difficult to handle and use tactically. Pretty much anything is on legitimate now.
So all the rules are off, and this is total war involving entire populations, and full mobilization of all the assets of the countries involved.
By 17,
and
absolutely.
Yet, neither side can really break the other, so they're kind of in a stalemate.
And the first one to go is are the Russians.
What happened?
They had fought, by all accounts, a terribly managed war, a terrible generalship. All of the problems that the Tsarist system had were laid bare. There were obviously good generals, and there were brave soldiers, and there were patriotic Russian people, but
where were the Russian soldiers
They were stationed on a very long, meandering line that initially they had tried to attack and had taken a chunk of East Prussia, but had been absolutely taken to school by the German generals there, who had far less resources, far fewer troops, but much better generalship, much better tactics. They don't feed their men. They don't care for their men. They don't get them home when they're sick. They shoot them constantly for insubordination. The officers were often political appointees with no military training. It was, and by 16, the Tsar's in charge. He takes over command of the army. He sacks all of his generals, and in effect, he lights a candle and says, God will let this all, Russia will persevere.
He's at the front. The Empress is back in Moscow with Rasputin running the country.
Who's killed.
And he was murdered.
As most of your viewers probably know, the hardest man to kill in history was Rasputin. Everything you could imagine could go wrong for Russia did. It was the classic example of here's a system that was teetering and bankrupt and broken before the war. And then the war just caused everything to fall apart. So by March, they're done. And this is the beginning of the end of Russia as a participant in the war, because the Tsar has to abdicate. He tries to hand over his government to his brother, who refuses. Kerensky, a provincial government is set up under Kerensky, who, interestingly enough, if you'd gone to school in California in the 1970s, you could have taken a class from. He taught Russian history, and he used to be the president of Russia for a little while.
So he's running the provisional government, but that includes the the Bolsheviks, the communist
That's right.
party.
And the great mistake that he makes, is he assures the Allies that he will keep Russia in the war. And the Allies have to have him. If the Russians collapse, the French and the British will be exposed to 1/3 of the German army, depending on how they had deployed.
The Germans would be able to move away
Absolutely.
from the East Prussia region in the east to the Western Front.
That's right.
Join that.
And the collapse of the Russian front is going to be death to France and Britain. And that's when the Germans begin to sink American ships. Those two events happening within days of each other are some of the most amazing, like I said, this feeling of what you would have gotten if you'd been living through these days must have been just so unbelievably pressure-packed. If you had a map, could read the papers, could understand these changes. In hindsight, of course, it's 2020, but the fact that the Germans decide in the spring of 1917 to begin to sink American ships as a risk they're willing to take, at the same time that the Russian front is beginning to collapse.
And the Russian monarchy has collapsed.
The Russian monarchy is going to collapse. Russian military effort will collapse with it eventually. Those two trains passing each other are some of the most amazing things that happened in World War I. In the midst of that, of course, the Germans have a secret weapon, and that's the rail line that they're going to let Lenin use to get out of Switzerland and get into Russia. And they package him up, allow him to travel through Germany, someone who's absolutely committed to the destruction of everything the Germans stand for in their Kaiser and their system and capitalism. Lets them cross the country, gets them in through Finland. He enters into Russia by under kind of stealthy circumstances and starts preaching Bolshevism and communism
and get out of the war. So the Germans, knowing that they might have to deal with him later, they realize that if he can get them, the Russian army, out of the war, they have a tremendous benefit.
And it works. The other thing that the Germans decide to do with this attacking Americans, they also, as some of your viewers know, start to make overtures to the Mexicans, who we had been involved in their politics and had invaded them at that time in 1916. We had various punitive excursions into Mexico. We find out, thanks to the British, that they have been chatting with the Germans, and the Germans have made all these wonderful offers that they'll get Arizona back and New Mexico back in exchange for attacking America with Germany. One of the most credible bits of spycraft ever is the discovery of that Zimmermann telegraph and how the British were able to use it, release the parts that they wanted to the Americans in order to really incense us.
Now that was a factor then at this point the United States is officially not in the war, but our ships are being attacked, and we are helping the Allies. And then
selling to them freely.
Okay.
The Germans can't buy a thing from us because every single one of their ships have been swept off the sea by the Royal Navy within the first couple of weeks of the war. So the only people who can buy from the Americans are the Allies.
But is there a movement afoot in the population here in the United States to join the war, to help our allies?
Teddy Roosevelt's at the forefront of that. He had failed in his 1912 bid to get reelected. Spends the next 4 years calling Wilson basically coward, and I'm being kind. He was a lot more fluid in his language, and goes around the country basically fermenting anti-German feelings. One of the more interesting things during that period is from pre-Lusitania in particular. The German-American population of America was largely supportive of the Kaiser, felt that the British were still our mortal enemy after the Revolution, War of 1812. Think of the Irish in America, what their attitude towards the British must have been.
These are the largest
the two largest Caucasian groups in the United States.
The German Americans and the Irish Americans
are not in favor of this war, at least not siding against the Germans. Irish nationalists, people who had real concerns about Ireland as an independent country as opposed to part of the British Empire. There's no clear consensus through 1915, even after the Lusitania, that Germany is the one to blame and that they are the Hun. And I think in the earlier shows, we talked about some of the things that the Germans had done in the early part of the war. They had not covered themselves in glory, to be blunt. They destroyed villages, they'd shot innocent people, they had burned down whole towns. They used this 10-to-1 or 100-to-1 reprisal system. For every German soldier shot by a Belgian farmer, they'd kill 100 Belgians. They had
no hearts and minds effort here.
None.
But back in America, then these two communities would seem to be naturally opposed to our entering the war. Teddy Roosevelt is pressing for us to get involved.
Yes.
And what turns Wilson's mind about this?
The last couple of
President
ships where he had sent note after note to the Germans saying, this isn't, you have to stop this. And they began to they just ignored him. And they just, I think one night they torpedoed 3. And he really was under enormous pressure to do something. So he sat down at his typewriter and typed out a war message, brought it to Congress, nearly unanimous approval. One woman, pacifist from Montana, I can never remember her name, voted against it. And just the whole country at that point flipped. And he unleashed this enormous jingoism and nationalism. We got a little taste of what that can look like in the aftermath of September 11th. Most of it's positive, the flag sails, the singing of God Bless America and everything. Not all of it is.
But at this point, the American people are angry at the Germans,
right,
at the Axis, and they're going to get even, and we're going to show them that we can end this war.
And they go, the federal government, the state governments, media, the opinion makers of 1917 America go all in. And dissent is treason by the end of 17. You can't stand up in a bar or at a public space and say this is a terrible war. There was no real anti-war movement to speak of because it would have been beaten down. The Liberty cabbage, there used to be sauerkraut. One of the things I did when I was in college was I went home I did a paper on World War I, and I went to the local library in Alpena, Michigan, and I pulled out the city directories from 1910. Alpena has a pretty substantial Polish and German population. And then I pulled out the city directory from 1920, and I compared street names, street addresses, and last names. The number of people who lived in the same houses but were no longer the Schmidts but became the Smiths. By the hundreds of thousands all over the country. German names ceased. They knew that they couldn't really send their kids to school with the last name of, Müller or Bacher with 2 Ks. It was just impossible. So they became anglicized. And it was a pretty interesting paper to write because, to look at, these were streets I knew, and the families had changed probably over the course of the years. But Polish Americans, interesting position because half of Poland was under German control. Whereas most Polish Americans were Polish nationalists in the sense that they wanted an independent Poland, which they will get in the end of this war. But their heritage had been kind of a mixed of German, Russian, Polish, depending on where you were from. And obviously both those larger countries had no interest in an independent Poland, none. So there's all these different ethnic groups in the United States who, if you watch the old movies, all blended together into what I think we probably should need to talk about next is the American Army that is sent to France. And that's an interesting organization. It's unlike any American Army before or since. With the exception of the one that went to fight World War II on a larger scale. But pretty amazing force.
Well, let's come to that. We'll take a short break here. to let our viewers have a little stretch break, and then we'll be back in just a minute. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're back with Brian McCall. We're discussing World War I, and we're just about to get to the subject of the American entry into World War I. Brian, why don't you pick it up?
Well, if viewers are interested, there's a really great book called Yanks, and it's written by Dwight Eisenhower's son, John. An excellent history of the American Army in World War I. It's easy read, well documented. It's a straight up academic history book, but it's meant for a popular audience, so I'd highly recommend viewers look at that one.
Were we well prepared for jumping into World War I? Hardly.
And that is one of the most amazing parts of the story is from 1914 on, we had access to the Allied armies, the Germans for a while too. We could send as many advisors that we wanted. We were allowed, Americans were given kind of a wink and a nudge if they wanted to go fight. So on a French squadron, the Lafayette Escadrille, which some people have heard of American soldiers, American airmen flying for the French Air Force. Lots of Americans crossed the border into Canada, joined up Canadian units, went over and fought. Jim Harrison, our local author, writes about that in Legends of the Fall. So a fair number of Americans had been in the news media business. They'd seen, heard, watched what was going on. They should have known. And our Army, not the Navy, the Army was not really prepared. They don't do much of anything other than watch. And if there's a military historian out there who wants to challenge me on that, it's the whole year that it takes for us to build the force that we needed to in order to get to France and be an effective force. That's the indictment, as opposed to 1941-42, where it takes 6 months and under much different circumstances, much more trying circumstances. But American soldiers had been in the Army since 1940. The draft had gone into effect much earlier. They began to ramp up much faster. And no, we weren't ready when Pearl Harbor happened, but we were in a lot better shape than we were in April of 1917. And that's any historian who'll look at that you can't make that claim that the Army was ready. They just weren't. They didn't have enough guns, uniforms, training camps, everything. They just didn't know what the scale was going to be.
So we had a declaration of war against the entire Axis right then in April of 1917, and then we had to deliver.
We were in Mexico the year before, and it was a fiasco. Pancho Villa ran away from us multiple times. Pershing, the commander of this, he was lucky he was able to keep his job after all of what had happened. They had not really prepared for what a real, especially after what had happened at the Somme and in Verdun. The ability to have observers and watch this, the scale of these armies, to realize what kind of infrastructure you would have to have if, God forbid, we ever had to do what we needed to do, it just wasn't there. The Navy was ready. They had watched carefully what had happened on the high seas. They saw the success that the Germans had had with the submarine. They saw the battleship fleets, interestingly enough, really not play very much of a role in the war at all.
So destroyers and cruisers were
smaller forces, escort
convoys
forces,
and things
much
like that.
more important. The Navy learned faster, and I think that's because, for a variety of reasons, but they may have been a little closer than the Army was to what had happened, and they may have been a little less parochial. I'm not sure.
And Pershing he retained the lead. He was the man who took the Army.
He's the one who takes the Army. The job that they do to build this force in 17, to get them in place by the spring of 18, it's an amazing job in hindsight, but it could have been a lot better.
So 10 or 11 months,
Yep.
and the American Army is supposedly ready to fight.
Right.
Now the Germans want to move before that happens. So what do the Germans do?
The Germans, once their plan to place Lenin in place in Russia begins to show fruit, obviously, with the October, November, depending on which calendar you want to use, revolution in Russia. And the first thing that Lenin does once he's seized power is to say, we are out of the war, we're done. And they begin to negotiate quickly with the Germans and settle at this treaty called Brest-Litovsk, and basically say, you can have whatever you've won in exchange for we're done. See you, good luck. We'll be back to take out you later when communism triumphs, but in the meantime here, we'll have peace for now.
So all the territorial gains of the Germans on the Eastern Front are kept by the Germans temporarily, let's say.
And they quickly, using their rail system, empty out the Eastern Front of German soldiers, as many as they possibly can, with the exceptions of some that they send to prop up the Austrians against the Italians. And they move them to the west. Now, the British and the French know this is going to happen. They just can't do anything about it.
They have no more troops to
They
offer,
really don't, and they see it coming. They don't know when it's going to happen, but they know it's going to happen. And in the meantime, the American army is beginning to arrive. At the end of 1917, they start to show up in big numbers. The irregular army that always had been in being in America began to arrive early in 17, but the big forces start to come at the end of 17. They show up in Le Havre and in Brest and work their way to France and start to learn how to fight a 1918 style war. But it's going to take a while to turn them into anything other than cannon fodder. And there was, this is where Pershing really probably performed his greatest service, is he refused under any circumstances to start pulling out units and plugging them into the holes that the British and the French had had in their lines, and to begin to use up his men piecemeal as opposed to a legitimate, full, absolute American army that's going to be used independently under a unified command, but used as an American army commanded by American officers.
So we're going to have our own piece of the front. Now, it's going to be just American, under unified control of the Allies.
And that's one big thing that the Allies had figured out, that the working together with the French and the British over time, the need for unified command became clearer and clearer and clearer. And for somebody in the business that you've been in, you know that.
It remains justification for NATO, really, to have that unified command structure. Yeah.
So that is the big advantage that the French, the British, and the Americans have, is that they, A, know it's coming, and B, have a reserve force in these young American soldiers who are the doughboys coming off the boats. And that's when the Germans launched this massive, massive attack. It's the largest attack of the war, except compared to the ones that will be following it with the counterattacks in 1918. So when they do fire the rockets in the air and the whistles blow, the French and the British just collapse in large part, and the front shrinks very quickly. The movement towards Paris is a lot faster in some respects than it was in 1914. And there's very little the British and French can do other than trade lives and space for time. And they get it. They get the time they need to build a line along the Marne, again, like in the first show that we did, and wait for the Germans. And that's when the Americans fill the hole. And that's the Germans at that point are exhausted.
And there's a fresh, strong American force now on their flank that they've got to deal with.
It ends up running out of gas at a couple of different places on that line. One that some of your viewers may have heard of, Bella Wood, which I've been to. It's a very beautiful American cemetery there, mostly defended by Marines, although there were Army units nearby. And the Germans find out that the Americans are not pushovers, and they will fight and they'll die. They will not run away. And that really does show them that they now have a war that they probably cannot win. By the end of April, May of 1918, when the German offensive pretty much runs out of gas, they know this is it. If they haven't lost the war, there is no way for them to win it at that point. And during all of the time of the offensive, Foch, the French supreme commander, is preparing for this big, gigantic counterattack that he's going to launch in the summer of 1918 to push the Germans out of France once and for all. And I always think, when I think about this war, of the soldiers that were involved who had been in it from, if you'd been in it since 1914, you're home with a bullet hole somewhere in you. The idea that you would have been able to still be intact, either in mind or in body, after all of this is almost impossible to imagine. But let's say that was possible, that the thing of seeing that this may come to an end, but knowing the enormous cost of winning that war in those last few months. And that's a part about 1918 is such an amazing year. There was so many things that began and ended then. And the end of a German Kaiser-ruled Central Europe. The end of the idea that the United States would ever be, at least in fact, an isolationist power. There was no more standing on the outside looking in. The end of the British Empire, although they didn't know it at the time. The end, obviously, of whatever you want to call what Tsarist Russia was. They'd killed the Tsar by 1918. There's so many things. The whole idea of
hereditary monarchies is disappearing in Europe.
The end of the Austrian Empire.
Yeah.
So can you have a heterogeneous multilingual empire under an emperor?
Mm-hmm.
No. Mm-hmm. Not in Central Europe after 1918. On top of that, the flu comes and begins to kill people in the hundreds of thousands. What's called the Spanish flu now. When it's all over with, estimated 25 million. More that actually killed by a factor of 2 in the World War. Killed by the flu in 1 year around the world.
Tremendous. Yeah.
I was looking at a couple of things here before I came here. The last U.S. Army versus Native American battle took place in 1918 in Arizona. There's so many things of that year that are such a beginning and the end of the world that was and the world that is.
That's, in a way, the world is being set up for another series of conflicts. So if we could turn briefly to the Middle East, and
right.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, the British and the French basically surreptitiously divide up what's going to be the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire collapses.
And they apparently forgot to tell anyone who actually lived there that that's what, in fact, was going to happen.
Done, right?
Yes.
So people have seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, right, and may have a vague recollection of the Arab army. What were they doing, and what was that all about?
Yeah, that whole part of the war is it's more romantic, to be honest, which is why they made the movie.
Mm-hmm.
It has there aren't trenches. It's not cold, well, at least not in the day. It has an enemy in the form of the Turks that are an interesting group of people, because in today's world, when you think of Turkey, this is also the first modernized Islamic State. And it was in the midst of that modernization, at least in a lot of its equipment and some of its attitudes, during the war. So it has, compared to the Arab states that it fights against in the Arabian Peninsula, it's far
more. There are more tribes, really.
More
tribal,
tribal,
not really states.
Yes. The movie, it's always, every time I watch that, imagining Peter Ustinov as an Arab is a little bit of a stretch, but they do a great job of illustrating the tribal nature of the people who lived on that peninsula. And then you enter in this amazing person of T. Lawrence and what he's able to do, and promote himself very successfully afterwards and during. The upshot of it is that whatever happened in the desert wasn't as important as what happened at conference tables in the major capitals afterwards and before. And the British and the French could look at maps. They knew what their needs were, and they were willing to do whatever military and diplomatic steps that needed to have happen to make sure that those needs were met. Access to India. They've clear signs that there's a lot of oil in the Middle East. Oil will be the new coal of the 20th century. The naval,
important for
that
the
is
British
incredibly
Navy.
important for the British. They went to war with the Navy fed by coal boilers, and in a world before radar, coal smoke on the horizon signals the arrival of a fleet, whereas oil-burning ships like the Americans had, the U.S. Navy used oil. Teapot Dome later was a part of that, the scandal about where the oil is kept for the Navy. But American Navy ships could operate at sea with less smoke. A little extra thing, but every little bit counts. The British know they need that, and they need access to India at all costs.
So they make a deal with the French, and the countries we hear about today, Israel, Palestine,
Right.
Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq. These are all involved in this carving up of the Middle East that is going to come back to haunt everybody in the years after the First World War.
Yeah, the images I always like to talk about with my students are: imagine a room with where everyone in the room is white. They're all middle-aged or elderly men. They're either in uniforms or suits, and they have maps of places that they've never been to, and they're looking at them and carving them up and deciding who's going to get what. And no one who lives in these places is in the room where the decision's really being made.
Or understands the tribal nature of those places.
Right.
So, well, we're left with that legacy.
Yes.
So let's go back to the main battlefield. The German offensive has stalled and been repelled. Now what's happening?
That's this is the part where those who like to have technological explanations for Hitler, almost said Hitler. Technological explanations for history.
He was there as a corporal, right?
The amazing story of, I think, something like 1,300 in his regiment. He was one of 3 to survive the war.
Really? Wow.
Marked for death multiple times, survives, is in a hospital when he finds out about the armistice. But if you like technological answers, one of the things you could say about 1918 is that the tools of war that had been there before the war started, centerfire, bolt-action rifles, held by trained infantrymen, high velocity, high explosive, quick firing artillery. The French 75 is the kind of like the prototype for all of the other guns that will come from that. Machine guns, gas, although it's not as big of a factor in the last battles as it was in the stalemate part. And most importantly of all, but it was nowhere near as important at the time, were airplanes. And with the Wright brothers in 1903, by 1914, airplanes are not common, but they're not unheard of. Most people here in the United States, I keep looking for references to airplanes in the Record Eagle when they do that on Mondays, this week 100 years ago. I haven't seen one yet, but I would imagine most people in 1913 knew about an airplane, had heard about it. And the gentleman I can't remember his name, who'd flown one over the channel. There was a use of airplanes that was there before the war. By 1918, many people had realized how vital control of the air was if you wish to control the ground below.
So this shifted from just observation to actual bombing and dogfights, the famous Red Baron. And
over all the big battlefields of 16, you would have seen air battles going on, but they're not necessarily tactical in the sense that the airmen are not coming down out of the sky and helping the infantrymen achieve their objectives on the ground. The infantrymen and the artillerymen were fighting their battle. The artillerymen absolutely relied on planes for observation and marking and whatnot, but they could get that information from other places. They could get it from barrage balloons, from spies, from other sources. The infantrymen, for the most part, looked up at the sky and looked at the airplanes and said, "My God, that must be a hell of a way to fight a war."
To be up there.
I mean, if they might not have known that there's been, life expectancy in a plane was about 2 weeks For airmen, they didn't have parachutes. Many of them carried sidearms to shoot themselves in the event their plane caught on fire. So, there was a lot of glamour involved in that, but it was also dirty, deadly business.
Speaking of which, what about the tanks? They were a big
They
factor?
had come online in '16, but had not been. The British were left with a really interesting problem. They had a war-winning weapon that they knew they didn't know how to use, knew it was going to have multiple problems, and they couldn't make enough of them in the first time to really unleash them all at once and use them in a decisive way. So they're used at the Somme battlefield. They scare the hell out of the Germans when they see them for the first time. But most of them broke down after about 200 to 300 yards. And a broken down tank is just another fixed position on a battlefield.
Yeah.
So, but by 1918, these weapons, planes, tanks, using truck transports really efficiently, the logistical backbone of these armies, especially on the Allied side, was resilient enough that it could move up supplies and supply big armies on the move. That had all gotten quite refined.
So really the automobile, the truck, is probably the most important of the technological advances.
And before the show started, I said, as an officer in the Vietnam conflict, I'm sure you have memories of seeing big fields of tanks, at least to your stateside or otherwise, watching tactical air forces being used. You would have seen these scenes in 1918, but with canvas-covered planes and older tanks.
Unreliable tanks.
The Americans, the British, and the French, at different points of the line in the summer of 1918, sometimes used these very effectively. In what today would be, even by today's standards, would be really considered to be relatively not without casualties, but legitimate casualties considering the amount of ground that they took and objectives they gained. They were learning how to do it.
Now, we got 6 or 7 minutes left, and we've got to wrap up 1918. So what happens? The counteroffensive now is well underway with American troops. The Germans had made a peace proposal, which basically was, we'll keep everything we've gotten since the beginning of the war, and the Allies say, no, thank you, we're going to push you back.
And the big day is, I believe it's October 8th. I'll look again, but it's one of these days where during Meuse-Argonne offensive, which is the last big one that the Americans launch against the German forces, and the one where I think in the beginning show I said if your visitors go to France, your viewers go to France, they absolutely have to go to the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. It's fantastic. I believe it's October 8th when the Germans basically can't resist American pressure anymore, and they break. And Ludendorff and Hindenburg, the two German commanders at that point, go to the Kaiser and say, it's a black day for the German army. We're not going to be able to hold on any longer. And at that point, by 1918, the German army was probably, the average age was pushing 16. Supplemented with people who look like me, late 40s. The young men who, if you've read All Quiet on the Western Front, were gone. They were all gone. They were very few of them left. And they had no reserves. And that's where things began to fall apart pretty quickly in Germany. The realization that they can't win the war begins to filter back home. In Berlin, there's a coup, for lack of a better term. The Kaiser abdicates, goes to Holland, takes his dachshunds with him, dies in 1941. I think he may or may not have met Hitler once while he was in exile in Holland. The collapse of German military authority at home happens before they begin to make the negotiations that ends with the armistice on November 11th. Rumors of the armistice coming by the 1st of November are really rife along the front lines.
So the troops know, and they don't want to be the last man to die in this bloody battle.
And those cemeteries are quite poignant. When you see the people who died on the 5th, the 7th, the 8th
Yeah.
of November. You just kind of, at one point, just kind of hope that they died in a hospital, and not thinking that they might survive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they still continue to fight right till the end. At 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month. So
11, 11, 11, and
an
next.
American artillery unit fires the last shot.
Mm-hmm.
They had the honor, or whatever you would want to call it, to officially end the war at 11 o'clock. And the feeling of those who'd survived must have, it's hard to imagine. It just really is. I think we may be seeing this in a in a microcosm with the individuals as our soldiers come back from these wars we've been fighting for the last 10 years. But they're coming back in small groups, not big ones. There's no such thing as what happened at the armistice, where everyone stops at once. That's not the way that the wars that we've been fighting have ended. And the feeling of, combination of you survived, and yet what a waste, what a disaster for the world.
And to sum it all up in our last couple of minutes, then, we really haven't solved a lot. The League of Nations is created, but proves
Fails.
to be ineffective. The German surrender creates conditions in Germany that lead almost inevitably to a rise of Hitler.
And were known at the time to lead this way.
Yeah.
There was, the peace treaty there, the assumption was, although the details of what was going to happen weren't known, but most people assumed that the Germans were going to get it in the neck in Versailles, and they did. Left very little to
They had
bring
no
home.
option. They had to accept these terms. And then yet, even the politicians who were involved would recognize that this is not going to solve anything, that
No.
the Germans are going to feel they've been had, and they're going to want to get even, and they did. Within not many years.
20 years.
20 years later.
The sons of the fathers
Uh-huh.
fight World War II.
And in 1933, Germany is already in upheaval. Hitler is taken as part of government. And the path to World War II is already well prepared.
Right. I always feel, my mother was born in 37, and actually both my parents were, and I often talk to them about what it was like to live through World War II as children, and what they remembered and what they don't. And one of the things my dad told me is that it was so sad for his grandfather, my grandfather, his father, to live through with his childhood of the world. He didn't go fight. He was a auto worker during World War I, of thinking that his world would always have these 20-year cycles of peace followed by carnage, and that this was just the way that the human race was going to kill itself eventually off completely. And we talked about this in the first show. Before World War I, war was seen as, at its worst, a terrible disaster. But in many cases, it was always used as a solution to problems. It was a romanticized,
Noble, romanticized, yeah.
what did Clausewitz call it? Politics by other means,
Yeah.
fought by armies, which you trade your life for honor. You have this role that you are representing your country. And I always tell the students that irony was invented in the First World War. I mean, it had been around before, but it really came on into its real meaning of what, the cynicism that was so deeply embedded in the people that lived through this. The dead were dead, but those who survived, who could walk away from that not having been completely systematically gutted from the inside out about what you really believed in 1914 to what you saw had happened in these 4 years.
It's a great tragedy. And
Yes.
Brian McCall, I want to thank you very, very much.
Oh, this has been a great pleasure. I've enjoyed this immensely.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been our great privilege to have Brian McCall. He's an instructor at the Interlochen Arts Academy, a graduate of Central Michigan and Strathclyde University, and obviously, if you've been watching these shows, a great expert on World War I, and I'm sure many other subjects, which perhaps we'll get him back to talk about some of those in the future. Thank Thank you all for watching Beyond the Headlines.